Welcome back to Swiftly Speaking, folks. My name is Paul Hudson, and this time I have episode 9. My friend Meng To has come to talk to us all about SwiftUI, about designing for SwiftUI, coding for SwiftUI, and also design skills that developers should have to really improve their knowledge, improve the kind of apps they can put out there. I want to thank you all for coming along. You're here live on YouTube, which means you can ask Meng questions. I have stacks of my own questions to ask him, but we have a chat window as well. I encourage you to go ahead and post questions in there about those topics, SwiftUI coding, design, and design for developers, and I'll make sure and ask as many as I can to Meng. While I'm here, I want to thank my sponsor, Bitrise. They make it super easy to add CI, CD, signing, and way more to your iOS apps. Check them out at bitrise.io. Meng, how you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me. I'm a huge fan of Two Straws, SwiftUI by example. This is one of the top resources that I use when I'm creating my courses, and also one of the top resources that my students use after or while doing my courses.
Well,
I'm
really
really happy to be here.
Thank you very much. Although I should say, flattering me means I'm not going to ask you any hard questions. That's not how it works. You're still going to get the tough questions coming along.
Bring it on.
Well, let's start with the design part of design code, getting into SwiftUI design, because SwiftUI is very different to what we had before in UIKit. Lots of folks are now coming into it and learning with SwiftUI. What would you say makes SwiftUI so appealing to learners?
So I've been teaching a lot of tools over the past 6 years, and one of the key things that I'm looking for when teaching is to teach in the least amount of steps possible. And that's kind of like what learners are looking for. Is they don't want to switch between too many apps, too many windows, too many steps. And SwiftUI really brings that. You only have your code, and then you have your preview on the right side. And this is super important because you want to see the results in real time. So whatever you change, and you want to look at the least amount of code possible. It's very short, it's very expressive, and it's very easy to explain, especially from a UI perspective, hence why you have the UI in the SwiftUI.
Right, so because it is concise, you can say, hey, this one modifier gets you the result you want. I guess so folks can make progress more quickly and see the results of their work.
Yes.
But it seems also that SwiftUI is particularly popular with designers who, they weren't coders beforehand. They were designers doing Illustrator or Photoshop or something else. And they're coming to SwiftUI and thinking, actually, I can do this. So why do you think it's particularly appealing to designers?
So the thing about designers is that they're looking for something that is very closely related to a layout system. And a lot of designers, they know a little bit of CSS, they know a little bit of HTML, they know a little bit of prototyping tools. And so when they look at the tool like SwiftUI, which is, to me, feels like CSS reinvented in 2020, you're talking about stacks, you're talking about grid, you're talking about animations, states. So all of these things are very commonly related to the prototyping tools that they've been using, the CSS techniques, and it feels very modern. And again, the preview is just beautiful. So for designers, especially those who have used like Framer, for example, the classic version of Framer, or how to change from the beginning state to the end state in prototyping tools, or even now because of how design tools have become so sophisticated, such as Figma, such as Sketch, Framer, you can do so many things nowadays. Like, it's only this year that we started seeing this emergence of sophistication in terms of prototyping. You can now prototype states, micro interactions inside design tool, although it's definitely not as powerful as SwiftUI. So to be able to do that in something that is as simple as a prototyping tool, but also using real code, and to be able to collaborate better with engineers, I think that's the ultimate tool that a designer can hope for, which really helps their work.
Absolutely. We've got a question here from Platin21 who asks, for design, should one be more bound by the platform for the look, or how far can I really diverge? So we'll see some apps like Gmail or Google Maps that have Google's material design, because that's Google's design across all platforms, no matter what you use. Whereas some others will say, actually, I'm on iOS. I want my apps to look and feel more like iOS. What's your take on that?
I would strongly advise to go with the platform first. I think it's important to focus on quality, to focus on experience before spreading thin on multiple platforms. A lot of designers, they make the mistake to create a design that try to fit all, or for developers to create a code that fits all. But at sort of like at the mid road, the designer will soon figure out that, well, yes, it looks nice, but at the same time, there's always a trade-off. Instead of that, you should be focusing on a platform, and reduce the amount of steps. Focus on quality, focus on the experience, really, sponge the knowledge of the iOS guidelines. Because if you have 3 guidelines to look for, it's very different from having 1 guideline. If you have to satisfy 3 platforms, it's very different from having to satisfy 1 platform. So it's much better to do one thing the best first, and then if you see that there's a lot of people interested in your product, then you can say, okay, maybe it's time to expand. Maybe it's time to go to Android. Maybe it's time to go to web as well. So that's how I would do it.
Yeah. Certainly, I remember one of the very early things Apple said about iPad is everyone knows how to use iPad because they've used iPhone. And iPad follows exactly the same guidelines as iPhone. So if you can use an iPhone, hey, you can use an iPad. And because it's natural by that point. And of course you can say, it'll save us some time, save us some money, whatever it is, to take one guideline, apply it everywhere. But then you'll just annoy almost everyone. Android users won't like it, iPhone users won't like it, iPad users won't like it. We all feel grumpy. So at least, take the time to specialize and make it really, really right. Now, you mentioned web there in your answer. I know previously you've done a lot of work with web frameworks. How do you say SwiftUI compares to web frameworks such as React?
So if I look at SwiftUI, it's a lot closer to React than UIKit, for example, and the way that you even code some of the the layout, the modifiers, and stuff like that, and also the way you code the animations is very different. So yes, SwiftUI is much closer to React, which is why I believe there's such a popularity with SwiftUI right now, especially amongst people who are looking to learn iOS, right? Those who have learned Swift in the past, they love, Swift, they love the iOS platform. But the key is, how do you convince the rest of the audience, those people who are considering Flutter, who are considering Jetpack Compose or React Native, or all sorts of platforms that that does cross platforms and whatnot? Well, how do you convince them to use SwiftUI? And the key to me is that you have SwiftUI. I think it's a lot simpler. It's a lot more modern. It's it's made by Apple, which means that it supports all of these SDKs and powerful things that you can do in iOS, and it's native. So there's nothing you can ask more than that. Like, the power of native cannot be understated. And I suggest every designer, developers, to really look at how you can build something in SwiftUI before judging it. Because a lot of people are there like, hey, I want to wait a little bit for SwiftUI. I want to wait because, Flutter seems interesting. It's cross-platform. It has a lot of new ideas. But have you tried SwiftUI? That's the question. If you try it, please let me know, because I love it. This is one of the best things I've used, at least over the past 5-6 years, for sure.
Certainly there are some developers who say, don't learn JavaScript, it's not a nice language or whatever. But actually it's done a lot to inspire other languages, including Swift. As you say, SwiftUI does build on lots of the same concepts that really took off in React. And we should be very grateful to that community for inspiring this kind of work and letting us take ideas from there. Would you say that we had seen similar levels of interest from designers for React, or was it just another level for them? They weren't interested.
Well, you brought up a great point. React definitely inspired SwiftUI, in my opinion. To me, as a designer, I always look for the best ideas. I always look for the best tools to use. And, I'm not sponsored by SwiftUI. I'm not sponsored. I mean, there's no way I can get sponsored by SwiftUI anyways. But, it's just one of the best things I've ever used. And one thing that happened when I was teaching UIKit, because I've been teaching UIKit for about 5 years, is that one, it was very difficult to get a lot of people on board, especially in terms of getting storyboard. There's a lot of division amongst folks who are using iOS to say, okay, should I use storyboard? Should I use everything in code? Should I use interface builder? There's so many things. It's very divisive. And then, for me, it was very clear that if I wanted to teach the designers and get them to use Xcode, that I have to teach them interface builder and storyboard, and and try to connect it to the code. But the problem is not with interface builder necessarily. The problem is after, right, mid-road. You have to connect the IB outlets to the code. The editor itself, there's nothing wrong, but at some point, you're going to be like, I want to do more than this. I want to do animations. I want to make it more powerful. I want to have interactions. And if you want to do that, then you have to connect everything in code. And as soon as you do that, then it makes more complicated than either one. Either going to code only or storyboard only, which is impossible. And to me, SwiftUI feels like the answer to that problem.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a question here from Elliot Fowler, who says, given how much easier animations are to add in SwiftUI compared to UIKit, how do you recommend making sure you don't go overboard with them from a design perspective?
I mean, this is certainly a design question. What I would say is, just like in design, you have to have certain rules. So one of the rules, for example, animation should not be in a way. Animation should be transitional. Animation should be less than, let's say, 1 second. Most animation you're going to see on iOS is less than 1 second. And we're talking about clicking on a button, go to another screen, or clicking on a card, expanding the card. All of those things should happen less than 1 second. And if you're new to animation, a lot of people make the mistakes to do a lot of flipping, rotation, 3D stuff, and there's no sort of smooth transition between the states. So definitely look into transitioning as much as you can. If you're not sure, take example from Apple. They give you the best examples you can possibly get. If you look at swiping, when we got rid of the home button, for example, we had to use gestures. We had to use more animations and transitions. And so, Apple probably took many years to come up with sort of like the swipe from the bottom and the home indicator. All of these things have to be really thought through to get the experience that we have on iPhone 10. And now, fast forward a few years, and you're like, of course, this makes sense now. I don't need the home button anymore. But it was not obvious back then. So, definitely take example from Apple. They're a great leader in design, and they put a lot of apps made by their team. They have amazing animations. So if you're not sure in terms of design, in terms of animation, interactions, just take example from Apple.
I absolutely couldn't agree more. I mean, it's so important. Someone asked me a question recently. There's sightings from one of my pages saying, listen, when you have a navigation view with large titles and you push to a detail view, you should use the inline titles, the small titles, on the secondary view, the detail view and tertiary view and so forth. And they're saying, okay, cool, Paul, that's great. Where did you get that rule from? And I was thinking, I remember hearing about it. When was it from? And it ended up being from one line in WWDC 2017, iOS 11, when they had those chunky title bars coming in first. They mentioned, we recommend this behavior. But ultimately it came down to my reply, look at settings. Big chunky title, go in one screen, collapses down to an inline title. So if you're not sure, if you don't want to traipse through all dub videos for Apple advice, just run their apps, use their apps, and see how they behave. Because they're ultimately the owners of the platform. They're directing large parts of our UI. You can't really go wrong by mimicking what they do.
Yeah, and there's just full of gems in terms of the materials that they put out there. When I learned SwiftUI, and I'm sure it's the same for you, we had to look at their example code, right? Like we were looking at their tutorials, which is insanely well made. They have their tests at the bottom of the page. You open the source files, And of course, at some point they break because, SwiftUI was in the beta stage. But to me, it was the way to learn. And also the WWDC videos where they show a lot of the new techniques and the tricks that you can use. But eventually, everyone just flocked to your resources because you have just the best thing to Google for. But definitely that's how I started.
I totally cheated Meng. I stayed above WWDC. I was in the hotel above it, so I literally walked downstairs with my laptop saying, "Hey, folks, this is what I think is right. Is that right?" And they'd go, "Oh, yeah, that's perfect." And I'd go ahead and publish it. Because you know what it's like. If you're writing and trying things out, you're thinking, is this the best way of doing it? Is there a better way of doing this? Being able to ask the SwiftUI engineers, is that the best way? And they go, yes, that's fine. Rubber stamp, it goes out. So it was a big cheat, but it seemed to work well for me. So one of the things, of course, that SwiftUI does brilliantly is it works on all Apple's platforms across the board from launch. It's great on iPad, iOS, on tvOS, watchOS, and macOS. But as a designer coming into SwiftUI, what advice do you have for folks to make sure their designs for SwiftUI work great across all the layouts from, little iPhone SE size up to full screen landscape 12.9-inch iPad Pro?
So to me, one of the most important things is to first learn the platform. You have to be fully aware of what the expectations are of each platform. Android, they have this thing called elevation for shadows. iOS, they have this thing called the background blur, which is called now a material sheet. And iOS use the full screen mode versus Android. Usually, if you have a card, it's not always full screen. iOS use much bigger rounded corners because of the iPhone 10 sort of rounded corners. And all of those things need to be taken into consideration when you're designing for, let's say, from the web and you want to adapt it for iOS and for Android, or you're designing for iOS and you want to make sure that your design can translate well to Android and also for the web. It's important to look at these UI patterns, as I like to call them, to know what is it that users expect, and then you can sort of transform the design instead of saying, hey, I'm going to use a style that fits all without any change whatsoever. First of all, you have to lose that concept of having a single design that fits all. But you should welcome the idea of changing the design a little bit, just enough to make it work across platform. We're not talking about 10 steps. We're talking about 3 steps roughly. But we're not talking about 0 step, because a lot of people, they want to get lazy and they're like, hey, I just want to have 0 step, one code that fits all, one design that fits all. Well, that's not going to happen. And the same concept is with SwiftUI, right? Like if you look at the code, the same code can work on Apple TV, on the Apple Watch, on the iPad, but you might have to change a couple of modifiers, a couple of frame values and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, you need to adapt a little bit, and you need to reduce the steps, but it's not going to be 0. So that's how I would do it. The same for design as well.
Certainly, we've all seen those apps that are running on iPad, and they're basically iPhone apps, and they're running a table in the middle which scrolls up and down, and then just white space to the sides. I mean, Twitter was there for quite a long time, for example, and it doesn't feel good because you've got this very expensive, $1,000 device in front of you, beautiful glass, True Tone display, ProMotion refresh rate, yada yada yada, gorgeous thing, and it's occupying this tiny little scrolling space. It's not a great use of the device. It doesn't feel like you're really enjoying it. You might as well just pull out your phone. And with SwiftUI, Apple made this really, really clear. They're not trying to make a Java-like, write once, run anywhere. They made that really clear. We're not trying to do that. The goal is to learn once and apply anywhere. Learn the techniques, learn the modifiers, learn the layouts and the interesting tricks, tips you have, and then apply that to every platform. And then the third part, which you mentioned, is then tailor your layouts to each thing. This would work better by using the digital crown on watchOS. This needs play pause support on tvOS, or it's got to handle more things like menu bars for macOS. Tailor them to match the platform, to really take advantage of SwiftUI's power for that platform.
Absolutely.
So compared to UIKit, the older way of building apps for iOS, What would you say there are certain types of designs that SwiftUI make easier to do than UIKit would have done?
I think it's easier to do custom designs for sure, just because there's very little cost to changing the layout to maintain the layout. If you think about UIKit, for example, you have to use constraints, and constraints are extremely hard for anyone, not just for designers, but also for developers. And I feel for developers because in the design tool now, we are using constraints, and a lot of designers have trouble with that. Imagine in the design tool having trouble with constraints, being the person who designed the layout themselves, having trouble with constraints. And as we all know, in UIKit is like 10x that complexity of what you can find in Figma or in Sketch. In Figma and Sketch, you only have like, you can go from top, from the left. You don't even have specific units for those distances. It's just, hey, I want to, do a constraint from the top, from the left, and whatever distance that I already have right now, it's just going to stick to it. But in UIKit, it's like much more complex. You can sort of like set constraints between two elements. You can align them with each other. You can set a priority, of constraints, and then you have like fixing constraints. You have stacks that comes along with it. So it's very complex, even for a designer. Now, the reason why I say I feel for developers, because developers are not necessarily the one who created the layout. And as someone who didn't create a layout, to have to go into the constraint mode, which is a very mental model for a designer, is very difficult, right? Like for me as a designer, I created a layout, so I understand everything, every bits and pieces, all the distances, all the paddings. And when I go to storyboard, I understand how to set up the constraints. But having someone else do it for me, I feel for that person, which is why I feel like it's very difficult. Now, compared to auto layout, well, not auto layout, I mean Figma's auto layout, which is comparable to stacks in SwiftUI, it's extremely easy for anyone to set up stacks. Okay, it's you just select a bunch of elements, put them into stacks, set the distances. Everyone can understand that, right? And you're not going to have conflicts. You're not going to have to maintain it as much. And it's like SwiftUI was made to be adaptive from the beginning, and that I think is a very powerful concept versus UIKit. When it was invented, we had very few screens at the time, and I think it started like even at 1x screen in terms of resolution. So the way that you have to set up your mind to think about those layouts is very different from the way that we have to think about layouts nowadays, just because of sheer amount of devices out there.
Yeah. We've got a question here from Prathamesh Kawakar who asks, what can designers do to be more accessibility oriented and make accessibility a core feature of their designs?
I think this speaks to both designers and developers. One thing that I think a lot of designers can use knowledge is how dynamic type works and how they can use stacks to make it super easy to just set some sort of a bounds for their text. And regardless of the size of the text, it's still going to look great. And as we all know, accessibility is super important to Apple, very important to iOS, which means that you have to understand that your layout has to be transformable. It has to welcome all different sizes of icons, of text especially. And I guess that's also why I believe that Apple brought to us SF symbols, which is a font icons, and so that we can easily just change the font size based on the accessibility option, and it's just gonna increase the icons as well. And I think that's just beautiful. So that gives us a glimpse of the future of design. So designers need to learn those things for sure.
Yeah. Certainly, dynamic type support, because it is baked into SwiftUI by default. You're going to opt into it like you did with, UIKit. You'd say, give me this kind of thing. It wasn't the default. It is the default in SwiftUI. You've got to, ask for a specific size if you really want to override it. But the default is dynamic type. That should be the absolute bare minimum folk support. I'd like to hope. And I'm not saying, because you can go into settings and accessibility and drag the font slider all the way to the right with extra modes, and it becomes very, very large, you haven't got to necessarily support every possible size. Apple don't do, so their navigation bars don't get bigger and bigger and bigger till they have like one word per line. They max out at a certain size and they cap it. But then they start introducing other affordances, like, for example, if you long press on a tab bar icon because you want to read what it's saying, you'll get a zoomed up icon taking up the full screen to show you what it is. They don't just make the tab bar icons bigger and bigger and bigger because it would make the design unusable. So, put some thought into it. Designers and developers, dynamic type at the very least, but also, labels and hints and more to really help folks use your UI. And in fact, I've been thinking recently, it'd be a really good job interview question. Like, here is an iPhone with voiceover enabled. Just navigate to settings and turn it off. That's it. Really simple, because you can tell immediately the folks who've never even bothered trying voiceover for their apps. So they can't navigate around the system properly. They don't know how to do it. They won't respond to regular taps. So it's a simple way of filtering out folks who've never even bothered to try the absolute basics of accessible design. Anyway, let's go ahead and park SwiftUI design and talk about obviously where my heart really lives, which is SwiftUI coding, because I write stack SwiftUI code with terrible design. We'll come back to it later on perhaps. Let's start with some questions about SwiftUI and coding SwiftUI. When it comes to folks who are just coming to the Swift platform environment for the very first time, whether that's iOS, macOS, whatever it is, and they're thinking, okay, I want to make an iOS app. Should I learn UIKit or SwiftUI? It's a very, very common question. So what is your opinion on this, Meng? Should a newcomer to Swift take up UIKit or SwiftUI first?
I think that's a great question, and I've received this question a lot as well. And I would say that I'm very biased, and you should definitely anticipate the answer from me. But definitely SwiftUI. And the reason why is because, to me, one of the key philosophy of learning any platform is how do you get to the maximum results in the least amount of steps possible. And SwiftUI is the answer to that question, right? Like, you can essentially just go to content view, change a few lines of code, and you already have whatever it is that you're building right now. And you can use as much custom layout or something that is built-in controls such as navigation view and list view and all that stuff, and all of these things such as the button and all of these things. So it's very easy to get to the maximum results in the shortest amount of time. But what I see the problem with a lot of tools is that they also follow this philosophy, especially for prototyping tools. The problem with those tools is that the beginning is amazing. It's like the honeymoon period. You're like, oh my God, this tool is amazing. But then you spend a couple of days on it, and then a week, and then you realize that they haven't really thought through the whole journey, right? They didn't really brought you all of these powerful things you can do. But with SwiftUI, and that's what I love about SwiftUI, is or anything by Apple, is that they don't just stop at the beginning of the journey, right? Like, I'm still in love as much in SwiftUI right now as I was when I started, 10 months ago when it was out. So I think that's very important for any platform to follow that philosophy. It's not just to say, hey, we want to have a really great onboarding experience or a really great landing page showing this tool and what this can do, but also to say, hey, do you think that the people using SwiftUI are going to stick to SwiftUI in 10 months or in 2 years, in 5 years? And I think if you look at what you're doing right now and what I'm doing right now, I think the answer is pretty clear. We still love SwiftUI. We love exploring more and more of the updates that Apple brings to us, and and that's why I would always. I think SwiftUI is the future. As soon as iOS 13 is going to be out of the way in terms of requirement, and we're gonna have 90%, 95% device support, I think everyone's gonna jump on SwiftUI. And UIKit is still going to be important, and Swift is still going to be important to support whatever SwiftUI cannot do. And I think that's great that SwiftUI can sort of take the Swift code and make it work and use a lot of the stuff that UIKit can do. And so, yeah, there's just no way I'm going to go back to UIKit after this.
I refer to SwiftUI as the ultimate dub DC framework multiple times because I think it's really perfect for dub because you can get on stage and show a handful of lines of code, and it just pow, looks incredible. And of course, it's dub, so it's very controlled sessions. There's no one there saying, how do I change the table view inset separator sizes, which you can't do in SwiftUI, or where are the text views, or where are the collection views, or where are the, alerts with input text fields and so forth. It's great for doing these 40-minute wow sessions. But when you live with it for a while, like you said, you've got to realize actually there are some drawbacks here, things I can't do in SwiftUI currently. But of course, you could make a table from scratch if you wanted to, but you want to use the real list if you could, but you can't change some things about it, and that can be frustrating. And that's where the emergency backdoor to UIKit would be really, really helpful. Sadly, there isn't one. You can't say, okay, this bit you can't do. Let me just dig into the table view behind you. That isn't possible. So you have to have push to a new screen, which is UIKit, and then modify that in UIKit, then go back to SwiftUI for the things that you can't do very easily. That's a little bit frustrating sometimes, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not saying SwiftUI does everything. But one thing that it does great at is that it allows you to create these custom layouts, which is something that I've been focusing on. To me, creating a navigation view and stuff like that is easy, but also is not necessarily what I like to focus on for designers who wish to up their game in terms of UI. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to launching your app, people will always look for something that they're really passionate about in terms of what you're trying to create, in terms of animations, in terms of interactions, in terms of concept, in terms of new thinking. If you're always 100% always on the stuff that are built in and that looks just like another app or another Android app or another web app, then people are going to sort of intrinsically ignore some of the things that they're excited about. And I think at least my philosophy is that I should always be able to excite people when I create something. If I cannot excite people when I create something, then there's something wrong with me, or there's something wrong with the tool, or there's something wrong with the environment at which it inspires me to do that. And so, I think you're right. It does not do everything, just like any tool. UIKit does not do all of the things that SwiftUI can do, and SwiftUI cannot do all the things that UIKit can do. And that's, I think, is by design. Some of the things we will miss. I don't know if collection view will make sense in the future. Maybe they're going to reinvent a collection view in a better way. But what I can say is that right now, there's a way to do it. It's more complex than the collection view, but you can still do it. But most importantly, you can do very, very custom layouts. And if you look at the course that I put out there, or the tweets that people put out there about SwiftUI, including your apps, you can see just the range of UIs that you can see, that you can find and create using SwiftUI. And I think that's really exciting.
Awesome. We've got a question here from Eichenherz Mo, who asks, what are the biggest shortcomings of SwiftUI currently, in your opinion?
Yeah, as I just mentioned, like collection view, right? A lot of the things that you could do. Well, to be honest, I'm not the right person to ask this question because I don't have the same amount of experience with SwiftUI, with UIKit than you, for example. But definitely the first thing that comes to mind is the collection view. What else? The storyboard, obviously. The fact that you can sort of create, visually change everything kind of like in a design tool. In SwiftUI, you have to do it in code, which is fine. Because at the end of the day, what I noticed when I started with SwiftUI is that, in the preview, you can sort of drag and drop stuff. You can sort of, insert something and then drag it to the preview. I think that's nice. It's great for beginners. But at the end of the day, I'm like, well, eventually I don't even use it anymore because the coding part is so good. So that's kind of how I feel about storyboard as well. Like at the beginning, it's great. It's great for creating quick layouts. And eventually you just end up, having so much trouble, or at least you feel like there's a way to do it better or faster, that you feel like maybe I should just do everything in code. And I think SwiftUI is kind of that answer.
Yeah, brilliant. So We've talked already about how Swift works with React. You mentioned Flutter briefly as well, because that sort of it's like a triad almost. Folks coming to the platform and thinking, well, do I choose React? Do I choose SwiftUI? Do I choose Flutter? How do those things really compare in your eyes, and which would you recommend the most?
So Flutter is an interesting case. A lot of people are very, very excited about Flutter right now. And I can see two scenarios. And of course, this is just my opinion. One thing is that people are tired of React Native at the moment because of the shortcomings of React Native. As someone who has taught 2 courses about React Native, I can say that it does a lot of basic things well, just like the web. I love the web. Don't get me wrong. But when I code, when I design on the web, I definitely don't feel the same freedom as I have for SwiftUI or for, a UIKit, in terms of animations, in terms of like all the things that you can do, all the technologies you can do. It's great for sort of like a visual website, right? Like, you go here, you scroll down, you click here, that's it. But when it comes to the phone, right, you have access to the camera, to the, location, to all of these things, the sound, all of these things are very standard. And not just that, but also the animation on the web. Try to create a website that transition from every screen to another. You're not going to see, like 99% of websites are not going to do that because it's too complex to do it. But on SwiftUI or UIKit, you're going to see a lot of that. There's a navigation view which does that by default anyways. But in SwiftUI, you can create these animation states, and you can put views on top of another view using a Z-stack. You can hide them. You can use a condition. It's amazingly easy. So my thinking is that I think React Native is kind of like saying, hey, we can make cross-platform apps, but we're going to use the limitations of the web. Or at least we're not gonna be able to do as much as you can, at least layout wise. I'm not saying you cannot do all of access to the camera and all of the technologies, but there's definitely, it feels like there's a middleman or a middle person that's trying to translate everything that you do in React Native to make it work natively. And the thing is, it's also made by Facebook, which means that it might not have the same access as if it was made by Google for Android or Apple. And Flutter was made by Google, so that I think that's interesting. It feels more native in terms of the way you develop apps, and there are far more resources. So one thing as a React developer is that React is amazing, but at the same time, we all know that React relies on so many third-party libraries, right? There are so many things you have to download that you have to depend on in order to create something meaningful. And React Native is not very different from that. So, and by the way, I'm not saying this to shit on React Native, right? Like, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying this to have a fair opinion as much as I can to speak on the strength of each. I can say constraints in UIKit sucks, right? But Flutter, if you look at it, they have so many components readily available for you. They have created their own animation library. You don't have to download a lot of third-party stuff. And I think that's why people are so excited about Flutter. But as someone who has kind of like looked into Flutter a little bit, I can say that Flutter is a notch less simple than SwiftUI. And again, this is based on my limited experience. But I encourage everyone to try both. Right? Try Flutter and look at the code. All I can say is that from a designer perspective, I look at this Flutter code and I look at the SwiftUI code. I feel like the SwiftUI code is way more readable, easier to approach. There's a lot of weird things that I try to wrap my mind around, like scaffold, and they have so many components on top of each component. It's kind of like, when I read Flutter code, especially the template that they give, it's kind of like me going to the app delegate in SwiftUI first and try to read that before getting the content view. And I guess that's kind of my feelings right now. And I'm not saying it's not going to change, but this is how I feel right now.
I think it's really important that we have these options out there Just like, if you want to write a Mac OS app, you can choose AppKit, which is awesome. You can choose Catalyst, which is very, very good. And there's SwiftUI too, which is up and coming. You can choose which one makes the best choice for you, the best option for you. And of course, you could choose Electron if you don't mind burning through some RAM. But having React Native, having Flutter, having now SwiftUI, I hope we can get ideas from them. More ideas. Obviously, we've got stacks already from React, but look at these things and steal ideas. That's what great artists do. We steal ideas, and they all have their own pros and cons. React Native, I think is a bit of a misnomer. Yes, it does native rendering, but it doesn't necessarily mean native controls. They'll do their own drawing of certain things because they can. It's custom buttons or custom navigation or whatever you want to, so it can be cross-platform as opposed to the native built-in iOS tools. And of course, Flutter, as you said, is made by Google. So lots of folks are out there thinking, well, I've seen killedbygoogle.com. I don't fancy backing that horse, quite frankly, because we've seen too many times in the past where big things have gone, wow, from Google, and they've been brilliant, and then they've disappeared in a year, 18 months, 2 years. Because that team has moved on to other things. The novelty's worn off, the money wasn't there, whatever it is changed, the use case changed, and Google got bored of it and killed it. And if you are a small company who can pivot around freely and change your mind as much as you want to, fine. But some of us support apps for years and years and years. We want code that works reliably for a very, very long time that we can rely on. And that investment in our learning lasts a long time as well. We can say, yeah, I learned this thing. That will last me a long time. And I don't get that feeling from Flutter, at least not at this time.
I might have a different opinion. And I guess I have a unique perspective in the sense that we get a lot of feedback from different platforms, right? Like I know a lot of folks out there are focused on one platform. So for me, I do get a lot of feedback. I teach all different courses, all different platforms, all different design tools. I don't have a preference on one. I just look for the best ideas. I don't think Flutter is going to go away. Looking at the excitement, looking at what people are creating with Flutter, looking at the amount of updates that Google puts out there for Flutter, it feels like one that is ready to stay. That being said, I've always been a huge fan of Apple, and I'm extremely biased, but at the same time, I'm okay with that, right? I just love to be able to buy a freaking, AirPods, spending $200 on this, and say, I don't need to think twice about it. I'm happy with this decision, and then being completely blown away after purchasing it. And I'm so used to this idea that Apple is going to blow me away at some point. And that level of trust that I have on Apple is not something that I can compare to any other company. And so when I say, okay, well, SwiftUI is awesome, I also, in the back of my mind, I know that Apple is going to keep doing awesome stuff with it. And they have proven that with all the technologies that they have put out there, all of their products. And so if I was to put money on the table, I would definitely put SwiftUI. But again, I'm biased. But that's not to say that Flutter is not a strong contender. I'm really, really happy that people are kind of trying to go more towards the native route, even though I don't know what the difference between native and non-native anymore, just because there's a lot of like little gotchas, when it comes to React Native, for example. But it's definitely not in the days of Cordova and all of those platforms. The sort of like web-based platforms. Really? At least we got that out of the way. But React Native is kind of like the second step, and now Flutter is like the third step. But UIKit and SwiftUI have always been the ultimate tools for me.
Awesome. So you and I have both been noodling around with SwiftUI since day one, right? We downloaded the Xcode beta for 11 back in June the 3rd or so last year, whenever it was. Started throwing code, started trying things out, started to experiment. We've spent the last 11 months now, because we're 3 weeks short of dub next now. 11 months working with SwiftUI. What would you say to someone who's just starting out? Like, what would your top 3 pieces of advice be if you go back in a time machine 11 months ago and said to you who's just starting out with SwiftUI, what would your top 3 biggest pieces of advice be for someone who's just learning SwiftUI today?
Well, that's a big one. First of all, don't overthink it. A lot of people, they're like kind of shopping for the best platform right now. They're like, oh my God, should I use Flutter? Should I use React Native? Should I use like, don't overthink it. Have fun. Like if you have fun, you're going to get it. You launch your first app first. Don't think about launching 10 apps across 10 platforms. Launch the app that you're in love with, because you're in love with it, people are going to be in love with it as well, right? I think that's kind of like the principle that I go by. Have fun with learning. Maybe you're not going to have fun with SwiftUI, and that's totally fine, but please try it. And that's my word, and that's Paul's word as well. Like, I can vouch for SwiftUI. If you believe it, great. But at the end of the day, have fun with it. And thirdly is don't skip design. I think design is such an important part of development, not just for designers, but also for developers, right? Like if you look at all the successful apps, even the Mac apps, we all love Mac apps, right? Even though it's not an ecosystem that is healthy right now, we all love Mac apps. I use a lot of Mac apps. I can vouch for them. But you can see that they're very well designed, and they have matured so much over the past decades. If you look at any Mac app that you're using right now, if you look at the design, it's good. And for some reason, and oftentimes they're made by a single developer. So what I can say is that do not skip design. Design is very important. Design is not just about the visuals. It's also about the UX. It's also about your approach to code, how to make your code more beautiful, how to make your code more exciting. And obviously don't skip code, because we all know that code is at the back of every single app out there. So, design plus code, right?
There we go. I got the first one. Have fun. I definitely agree with that, because you want, honestly, just to try it out, folks, because it's one of the very few platforms where you can experience just joy, noodling around, trying things out, experimenting, and seeing what happens. You get really, really fast feedback, and you make gorgeous things. That was the first one, have fun. The third one was, of course, don't forget about design. Get beautiful code. Love beautiful code. Beautiful code is so important. Wouldn't necessarily say exciting code. I don't want exciting code. I want beautiful code, but I don't want to be excited by the code around me. I want to think, that's a bit too clever. It's probably a bad thing. Did I miss number two? What was number two? Have fun. Focus on design.
Don't overthink.
Overthink. Okay, there we go. Have fun. Yes, okay. Don't overthink, have fun, and focus on design too. So those three things, folks, to help you get started with SwiftUI as fast as you can, and just get in there and try it out, because it is there, built into Xcode, works on all Apple's platforms with varying degrees of quality. Give it a try, see what you can make, and see where it takes you. Now, one of the things we're finding as we was writing more SwiftUI code, building out bigger and bigger apps, is we have this. It's no longer massive view controllers, MVC. It's just massive views. With these huge views. And obviously we don't want that, because it makes it very hard to maintain code. You want code that is beautiful, as you say, but also maintainable and scalable and reusable and flexible and lots of other ibbles. But what advice do you give to folks to help them split up their large SwiftUI views into smaller, easier to understand, more reusable views?
Well, perhaps I'm not the best person to answer this question, but I'm going to try to answer from a designer perspective who codes. First of all, in the design tool, more and more designers are using components, are using design systems. So the way that I look at it is to borrow the same strategy to sort of like make sure that every single piece of code is reusable and is 3 steps customizable. Again, from that principle of the number 3, which is something that I've learned a lot from Steve Jobs back, in terms of like the way he thinks. The 3 steps is to make sure that you're not necessarily making like a component that can transform itself to be an app, or can transform itself into 10 types of buttons. But if a single button can transform into 2 types of button or 3 types of button, that's amazing. And I think that's kind of like you don't want to have like maybe 20 props. When I say props, variables. You might want to have 3 or 5 or something like that. Like, you keep it short, make it reusable, connect it to the design system, and try to be consistent between the design and the code in SwiftUI. So, for example, in a lot of the naming conventions that I try to do in my team, because a lot of our developers are not native English speakers, so they have trouble with naming their component. They have trouble naming their views, and they make typos. And so what I try to do in the design is to sort of say, okay, this is a list view or this is a row. So I put that in the design tool when I name the layers, and then when I ship it to developers, they look at it and they're like, okay, I'm gonna use exactly this name. So we try to be consistent, and during meetings and when we talk to each other, we can say, okay, remember the row view, then it's consistent across the two, and it helps with communication as well. So that's kind of how I look at it.
Yeah, consistency is key in so many things in our job. We've got a question here from Prathamesh Kawaka. It's a trickier one, I think, but I'll see what you think about this. He's asking, what are your thoughts on unit testing? Because ultimately, we want to make sure we have high quality tested software. You see software with no tests, you're like, oh goodness, will this work properly? You're actually shipping this thing. So what approach do you take when teaching folks to build apps with SwiftUI to help them test code with unit testing and similar?
I have to be very honest with you. I haven't done a lot of unit testing at all. Like I live on the edge, to be honest, and I'm not a fine example of someone who does testing for everything. And I also like to work a lot by myself or with a very small team, which means that, I also don't work on big projects. I know the value of unit testing. We tried to do that at some point when I was working with senior iOS developers, and we just couldn't get it to be deep enough for me to say, well, this is really crucial. But I understand the importance of it. I cannot offer like a good opinion that would help anyone.
Obviously, your code's just perfect, right? It doesn't crash. So tests aren't required.
No, it's just that to me, regardless if you're using unit testing or not, your QA should be here. In the team, we always speak about QA, everything you do. And it's one of the most difficult things to do, regardless if you're a developer or a designer. You always tend to think, okay, my work is done here. You're always like, hey, let's move to the next project, or let's move to the next thing. And a lot of people, especially the juniors, they finish their work too quick. They don't really look after. They don't test 10 ways. For me, I'm paranoid. When I have to launch something, I'm so paranoid. I would refresh it 10 times. I would, go back into the design to make sure everything looks great. The design system, the presentation, but especially testing. I have to look into my device. I have to spend like so many times like clicking everything, making sure that everything works. So for me, because I have been doing this for more than 20 years, it feels like I test everything. And I've never found the huge need, at least for the size of my apps, to really get into the automation and the unit testing and all that stuff. Again, I cannot offer like a better opinion more than that in terms of unit testing. But in terms of QA, I can definitely say that it's so important. And please test your design, test your app, make sure that everything's gonna work well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've already talked about some of the things that we think SwiftUI is missing. You've mentioned collection views, but they're also, text views are a real sore thumb right now. So I'm looking forward to seeing those come in 3 weeks or so when WW20 hits. But right now, we can at least backfill SwiftUI with UIKit components, with AppKit components, with anything else you need from the platform you're working for and designing for. So how do you handle that? How do you approach integrating key things from UIKit with SwiftUI?
Again, very limited experience here. What I can say is that during the course, one thing I wanted to do was the background blur, and I know it's not feasible in SwiftUI, so we had to sort of like use the UI view representable, and we managed to make it work. That was kind of the only thing that I really need to UIKit for the course that I created. Yeah, like I know also the pagination thing. A lot of people were asking about it, so you would have to use UIKit for that. But hopefully, yeah, at WWDC they're gonna bring some of those things, the collection view and the background blur, the material sheets. Yeah, that's on top of my mind right now.
I'm hoping for many, if not all of those things. I mean, fine, there are some slightly ones I worry less about, like, progress views or whatever. But, I want to see collection views desperately. But also, I want to see things from other teams as well. Because it's the first time everyone inside Apple has had the chance to see SwiftUI. If you imagine, 14, 15 months ago when it was still top secret, apart from STS, of course, knew about it, but no one else did. We know folks at Apple who are working on MapKit or Safari services or, I don't know, UI image picker controller. All the other parts of the system that we want to integrate regularly. Having Maps is great, having Safari embedded is great, having image picker is great. All those teams have now had a full year to work with SwiftUI and hopefully think, how does my framework fit into the SwiftUI world? What would a great map view look like in a SwiftUI world? So I'm hoping to see, yes, of course, stacks of UIKit controls coming on board, like UI page control, which you mentioned, but also stacks of controls from other teams as well, sort of seeing it for the very first time. So let's park SwiftUI coding and move on to our final topic, which is design for developers, because it's almost like a stereotype that some geeks just feel proud of. Oh, I just don't do design. I don't get design. I can't even spell Photoshop. Whatever. It's almost like a badge of honor that we don't use and understand design. And clearly that isn't great because we have to work alongside designers, and having at the very least a shared glossary of terms to work with would be very, very helpful. But it's certainly clear that you see a lot of developer artwork, folks who've had to build the app and do their own artwork. So let's talk about this kind of area of design for developers. And I want to start off with a simple question for you here. What would you say are the most common design mistakes made by developers? In a nice way. They're not actively trying to screw things up, but it's just common errors they make.
Sure. Proportions. Like font sizes. I've seen a lot of apps by developers where the font size is like this much. And when I look at that, I'm like, okay, this person probably came from the web or something, because, on the web, as you know, the font size are just much bigger. Colors, they don't know how to use colors. They see a designer using colors and they're like, okay, maybe I can use colors everywhere now. And they're like putting this purple background and then purple text on top of a purple background, and it's not even readable. So accessibility, a third thing, very, very hard to master, but should be done, especially nowadays. The focus that Apple has on accessibility, so contrast ratio. If you're a developer, I wouldn't use anything else than a white background, to be honest, because white background is the ultimate color for any app, and it's very consistent. It's very easy to use, and then it can translate to dark mode very easily. If you're a designer, you have a lot more comfort with colors. You can definitely end up using off-white. You can end up using dark blue for dark mode. But if you're a developer and you're not comfortable with colors, go with the more safe route. And it's when I say safe, I don't necessarily mean you're not putting your skin in the game and you're not doing anything exciting. You can bring excitement in other things, such as animation, such as the way that you can interact with the app, the new gestures that you can use. If you look at some of the stuff that we're really used to now in terms of like the pull to refresh, those are things that were invented by developers at the time. And, it's the kind of thing that I believe developers really excel at if they knew the power that they hold over design. The problem that I see with a lot of developers is that they don't believe that they have any power in design. But that's absolutely the opposite, in my opinion. Because if you work with any teams, and if you understand just enough design to be dangerous, such as some of the rules for typography, the colors that is already in the Apple iOS guidelines, the adaptivity of the layout, the legibility of the text, dynamic types, accessibility, um, all of these things, if they knew just like 60% of it, they can be extremely dangerous. And come the time that they have a meeting with designers, they can have a very strong opinion on how the app design should be moving forward. And not only will they improve the user experience, they improve the deadline in terms of how long it's going to take to make the app. They can collaborate better with designers, but also they can really shift the vision of the company in big ways. Instead of saying, "Hey, I want to make this card to be this way that the designer wanted," you can say, "What if we do it this way? And what if we use another technique, giving even more flexibility to the design, to the animation, but only know as developer, because the designer doesn't know. The designer doesn't even know about dynamic type, you know? And so what if you have this knowledge and you can pass it to the designer and convince them to use this technique, and it's going to save the deadline by 2 weeks, right? So that's the kind of power that developers hold.
Well, the very first thing you mentioned there was proportion. If you see very large font sizes and similar. You also mentioned, the rules of typography. Would you say that a developer could almost play it safe by sticking with the built-in dynamic type font styles, title, large title, headline, caption, just with those, or should they try to experiment?
I think, the same way I look at this first time that someone would draw on pen and paper, they learn how to draw. They would, look at a drawing and they would put it on top of another paper and they would draw on top of it. So at the very beginning, it's inevitable to mimic and to go with a safe route first. As long as you are satisfied, and I think that's the key word, to be satisfied with your design. And it does not have to be exactly like what Apple has, but definitely if you're using the same techniques, such as what you're saying in terms of using large title, body text, caption text, and all of those things, start with that. Once you get comfortable, then you can upgrade your skills. But always be satisfied with your design. You should never say, "Hey, I tried a 50 font size, I hate my design." Well, maybe you should just use a large title, right? And mix that with another one that goes well with a large title, and a good amount of spacing between the two, a good amount of characters per line, a good amount of line height. All of those three things, by the way, can make your design 100% better just by setting the right line height, setting the right combination of title versus text, setting the right spacing between the title and the text. And as we all know, like most apps are comprised of like 80% text. So if you master text, then you're already like you can easily create a beautiful apps already. If you look at the stocks app, for example, mostly text and then charts. So are you able to draw a chart? I'm sure you can. And you're just like, then you have your app. Use navigation view, tab bar, and that's it. It's not very complex. At the end of the day, you don't need to have everything custom made. You don't need to have everything super exciting and crazy. You just need one or two or three things, and that really blows people away. Maybe the way you animate the charts. Maybe it's the way that you do the loading screen. Maybe it's the way that you do the transition between one card to the full screen mode. Whatever it is, it's usually just one thing. If you look at, let's say, the App Store app, most of the design is just basic design, right? Like it's not crazy stuff. But there's one stuff that excites people, and that's the Today tab. And people always refer to that design all the time because they're so excited by it. It just sets the tone of why one thing can make such a huge difference in the way people perceive a design of something. And the rest can just be very normal, And that's the beauty of it. You can sort of like contrast the two. It doesn't have to be like 100% original. It can be maybe 5% original and 95% pretty normal, but still good, right?
Certainly, 14, 13 months ago, most developers I would think of would actually point to the apps tab or the games tab and say, how the heck did they make that collection view? Because they have this amazing collection view with multiple different types of layouts, and there's gorgeous, big pictures scrolling, little tables of stuff scrolling, and now, of course, we have compositional layouts ourselves. We're like, aha, that's how they made the collection view. I'm really glad I have that to myself. So yes, it certainly is interesting seeing how folks see the App Store differently. With fonts particularly, I think it's worth remembering that the dynamic type sizes like title and large title, it's not just the size of font and a weight of font. That includes kerning and tracking and leading, and it's all carefully custom designed to fit with those fonts. Apple spent an enormous amount of time making those work well together, and particularly with SwiftUI, when you think about, spacer, or the default behavior of stacks, where they have adaptive spacing by default. You don't say padding by default, you just say padding, whatever. You don't say padding 5, you just say padding, and it applies it to the right amount. And that's important because of these font sizes that are perfectly constructed. You can add adaptive spacing around them as needed to give a bit more white space, a bit of negative space around them, so it just has a bit more breathing room on the screen, as opposed to sort of squeezing things aggressively together, which you might do if you made your own custom font layouts and similar.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things you've touched on briefly in terms of app design is that you think it's important to have something that brings delight to your users, to make them really enjoy the app and love the app. But what do you think in terms of custom stock design? What developers, what can they do to help the app stand out above just stock UIKit / SwiftUI controls?
Yeah, just like want to have one or two things that really stand out in terms of the interaction. I think at the end of the day, if you are excited about your UI, people will get excited about your UI. And, we can speak about backend, but at the end of the day, as much as backend is really important, a lot of people are not going to see the backend part. But the UI part, they will definitely see. And you need to be able to express that to your users in a way that really get them excited. And sometimes it doesn't even need to be the normal users. It can be the power users. So for example, you can say, okay, maybe it's just use it yourself first. So that's the first rule. If you enjoy your own app, most likely people are going to enjoy your app as well. So if you think your design sucks, most people are going to think that your design sucks. So the key part is to enjoy your design, to enjoy your app, test it multiple times. And speaking about power users, these are the one thing that I learned as a creator for about 2 decades is that the power users are incredibly important. They are the ones that set the tone for the needs for your app, and especially moving forward after launch. They will be the one that come back to you and say, hey, wouldn't it be great if I can double tap on this picture and like it? Right? It's not hard to do, but it's definitely one thing that can make your app stand out based on the feedback of your users. And you're like, yeah, let's do it. And then you do something interesting, something exciting, and then suddenly it becomes standard everywhere. The same for the pull to refresh, right? Like, it's not something in your face necessarily, but as soon as people start using it and they're like, wouldn't it be great if instead of scrolling up and bouncing for no reason, I can actually refresh the app? Yeah, that's great. Sure, let's do it. And then you think about something, and then you think about the interaction necessary for that. As long as you see a problem or a waste of space or a waste of interaction, such as the scrolling, like, wouldn't it be great if you scroll at the bottom and suddenly it adds more items, as we call it now, lazy loading, right? It's all part of a problem, and it's all part of a solution based on that problem. So I would love to see developers do that more and say, like, hey, let's really get people excited about the interactions, and let's listen to feedback. Let's also really enjoy our own app and really be satisfied with our own design.
So I guess there's a trade-off somewhere between satisfying those power users, but also taking care of really good accessibility, really good discoverability. I mean, if I was thinking about, double tap to like a picture, I can see why that might be a shortcut for some folks, but then is that possible to use if you can't double tap very easily? Or, would you hit it by accident? Like you're looking through pictures of you at school, like that girl you liked from 20, 30 years ago, and you double tap to zoom in the picture and it likes it. You're like, no, she'll see an alert saying he liked my picture, and it's the wall of shame, There's a trade-off there somewhere, isn't it, between power users and also being accessible to people and also being discoverable to people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no perfect solution. Even the swipe from the bottom of the home indicator to go to the home screen can be done accidentally a lot. I don't know if you watch your kids using an iPad or an iPhone. They will most likely do that all the time, and it's so frustrating. But at the end of the day, you know what I mean? Like, there's no design that is perfect. And as long as you kind of follow the 80% rule, as long as 80% of people use your feature or use your design in such a way, then it's worth having it front and center. If it's not, then you can put it more in a hidden. So we're talking about visual hierarchy. All of those things, definitely I'm going to teach that in my course about UI design for developers.
So in terms of what UIKit and iOS offers us as developers, what kind of tools do we get in order to make great designs?
What kind of tools, like design tools or development tools?
Well, in terms of, if I was to sit down to code as a developer, I want to write some software, what systems, what APIs, what frameworks, what design tools, UI tools are actually out there in iOS to help us make great designs in our apps? Not just text and navigation and lists, but going beyond that, what kind of more interesting tools are out there for us?
Well, I'm not sure if I don't really want to repeat myself here, but definitely like all the techniques involved with gestures and definitely explore all of the gestures that are available to us in SwiftUI. They're incredibly really, really good. I don't know if you watched some of the videos that I made about the course, but I was able to do like a tap progress. There's so many interesting interactions that is on iOS 13. Especially like, for example, on the lock screen, you can tap on the button and it does this little morphing thing. And if you tap long enough, then you have a long press gesture. Then you also have a progress based on how long you tap it. So the longer you tap, then the more then the button expands. So developers need to explore more what they can do with animation and gestures, because this is so incredibly important nowadays, because of the removal of the home button. We're now have like a single screen that directs all of our interactions of our apps. So gestures are going to come into play increasingly in the future because of the learning curve. It took a decade to get here, if you think about it. Gestures wouldn't have made sense 10 years ago because people were still learning how to use buttons. They were still learning how to use keyboards a little bit more than a decade ago. But nowadays, there's a learning curve and people have learned it. People are born into technology. The kids, they know how to use technology better than us, and they know how to use gestures. And so gestures are becoming more and more important. What 5 years ago people didn't care about gestures, now they have to care about it. Like pinch, swipe from the bottom, double tap, and swipe down. It's a very common gesture to close a screen. And it's so common nowadays that when I open a new screen, I anticipate to be able to swipe down to close it, or tap outside. On the web, this is a very common gesture. You tap outside of the modal to get out of the modal. And so developers need to learn those interactions. If you can learn them, you can make them better. You can design better. and you can improve the user experience as a whole for power users and new users alike.
Certainly, it's important to remember that your UI principles do evolve over time. I was in the crowd at WWDC when Apple announced iOS 7. And it was, bang, what the heck happened? Where did my fuzzy felt and wood game center just go? And they made a really important point. They're thinking, why have we spent such a long time building this very real world skeuomorphic design ethos and everywhere in our apps, and now to throw it all away and focus on just pure text and flat colors and similar? And it's simply that, back then, when folks were getting started, we had to give these visual affordances to tell folks, yeah, this is pressable, this is interactable, this is real, tap this thing, because they weren't used to it on these, highly interactive, swipeable, pinch or zoom, whatever it is, touchscreens. Whereas now on iOS 7, which was obviously quite a few years ago now, everyone was used to it. They had 6 years of iOS by that point. Everyone's used to the idea of sliders you can grab and buttons you can press and so forth. So we can start to remove some things, remove some of that visual clutter and simplify it. And that's just going to continue. As you said, we're always moving forward and always, and soon iOS 13 will be considered very, very old. And of course, they've always worked that way. And we can stop relying on the old affordances and bring in new ideas and new principles. We've got a question here.
Absolutely.
From, it's just at the top of my screen actually, which is very annoying. Here we go. From Christian, who says, when does it make sense to introduce a new type of gesture in your app? Because of course in SwiftUI you can do taps and double taps and swipes and so forth. You can do simultaneous gestures, you can do sequence gestures, you can do high priority gestures. There's all sorts of gesture control. But when do you want to introduce a new gesture rather than relying on one of the built-in system gesture types?
I think it makes sense based on feedback. If you can make it save time for people, it makes sense to use a gesture. So for example, if you think about swiping down to close, well, it saves you time from using, let's say, a one-handed gesture. So one-handed usage of the phone to be able to not have to go with the second hand to go to the top right corner of the screen to close that button. And that's when it makes sense to use gesture. So I would definitely go with the feedback. I would definitely go with the saving time paradigm. So, if you think about, let's say, okay, maybe you have some hidden feature that is not easily accessible. It might not be important for all users, but it might be important for power users. And you're like, well, how can I make the like button easier to use in one-handed usage? Maybe double tap. Maybe swipe to the right, like Tinder, or swipe to the left. You know what I mean? Like, those are when gestures make sense.
Yeah. Actually, a point here from Prathamesh Kawakar saying, thanks Christian Selig, who makes Apollo, for that gesture in Apollo's photo viewer. And actually, I've thought, I should really do one of these episodes with Christian, because Apollo has some really nice UI touches that I wish, A, were in UIKit / SwiftUI, and B, I wish I knew how he made them, because I want to get it once. Like, give me the code for your stuff. Like, he has this thing where you can swipe back, in navigation. Of course, you can swipe back to the previous screen. But then if you change your mind, you can swipe the other way and get the screen back again. It's like when you send an email and you just want to just check what you wrote after you've sent it. It's that same sort of thing. You can swipe forward, or he has this thing where it's like dark mode but reduce smear, and it really works. And I want to know how it works. And gestures are great at that. That kind of swipe forward gesture to go back to where you were. I think that is intuitive. You want to get back to where you were, and as long as it doesn't collide with, table view cell, slide actions, swipe actions, then I think that should be a standard UIKit thing. So I'm holding out hope, perhaps, to see that in UIKit in the future. But custom gestures really can bring apps to life, I think. So,
yeah.
A question here about how we can create apps that are accessible to everyone. Now, we talked about accessibility a little bit already, but I want to really focus on it here because, as coders, if we're just doing terrible design, just raw, simple, flat design, we can make that accessible very easily because it's just text, button, whatever, nothing fancy to it. But when it comes to more advanced layouts, where there's animations or there's gestures, but also want to take into account things like reduce motion, or avoid using color for differentiation, for so forth. These are built-in accessible features inside iOS. How can designers or developers who want to be more designery build good designs while also really keeping at their core to be truly accessible to everyone, regardless of their access needs?
Sure. So we've discussed about dynamic type. I think that's extremely important. We discussed about the color contrast. So to make sure that, let's say you have a white background with a black text on top of it, use that all the time. If you're not sure about what colors to use, just use black and white. That's it. For the button, just use blue. If you're not sure what to use, just use blue. Apple has a very specific way that they're using colors to make the buttons. So the button color is actually the branding of the app. So if you look at the news app, it's like kind of red. If you look at most app, it's like blue. And each
color.
app have their own color. Right. The other thing I would say is that, at the end of the day, design is a lot about real life. And especially when it comes to animation. We cannot rely on the old paradigms of the web. When you visit the website, you go to another page, takes 2 seconds to refresh, and you're completely out of context from before. If you look at the reality in which we are, speaking about shadows, lighting, a priority in terms of visualization, when you move from one room to another, there's a transition going on as you walk to always bring the context. And as Diodoram says, one of the cardinal sin of design is to not care about the context. So it's very, very important that you make your design contextual, adapted to whatever needs of your users. And when it comes to animation, to use that transition to have a context from one screen to another, which is why I love, all of these interactions that you find on iOS. It feels like they have embedded this principle very deeply, and swipe, when you move back from another screen, or even when you get out of your app, it transitioned back into the home icons. It's just beautiful. Like it's all seamless. You go to a group, it opens, and it blurs everything, and then you have like the views on top. Like all of this, it's like walking from one room to another, and it's very transitional. They have perfected their motion. At the beginning, it was more. There were a lot of complaints about motion sickness. I'm hearing a lot less of that. So there's definitely like a bit of a tweak over time, but also they have perfected the way that you can turn off some animations for the motion sickness. So yeah, at the end of the day, it depends at which stage that you are in your design, which stage that you are in your launch. You don't need to sort of like afford every single aspect of accessibility, but if you can at least take care of the most important ones, such as dynamic type, do that at first. And if you see like you're starting to get a lot of users complaining about motion sickness, sure, let's add an option to turn off animation, or let's remove the animations that are too intrusive, which should never have been there in the first place anyways. And those are some of the things that I would look into.
Certainly, Apple's video from WW18 about designing fluid interfaces was a real eye-opener. They'd worked on the whole gesture-based UI for a very, very long time. It wasn't just a off-the-cuff kind of choice. And that gave them a lot of time to try things out, realize that doesn't work for another way, try something else, that didn't work for another way. And there were advice in there about, making really nice, let's say, interruptible animations. It's amazing because it doesn't take a lot of work to do in SwiftUI. It's just baked into it by default. And so you can get interruptibility out of the box. You can have very, very fine-grained controls over exactly how your app should work. And really, there's no excuse not to use these, because it often is one modifier or two modifiers, or maybe in maximum 3 modifiers to get exactly what you want and have that control. So I'm going to finish up with one question here, and this is a big one, but hopefully you'll leave us something on to go away and think about for the rest of the day. when it comes to advice for developers who want to do better at design, they want to take design more seriously in their app, what would you say is your single most important change they could make to improve their designs?
A single most important change?
Number one. You get one choice here. No cheating.
Yeah, typography would be the single most important thing that they need to learn. Just don't take too many risk, but also take risk, right? Like there's a fine balance between not taking risk and taking risk. Some developers they make the jump too high from one point to another, and in life, whenever you learn something new, the jump should not be too much. You should always focus on few key things that you can do, such as typography. Colors, it's not very hard. Black and white. Keep doing that. That's fine. You can use a little bit of opacity on your text, especially if it's black. 80% opacity is great, so that you have a bit of visual hierarchy. Focus on the content. Content is always king. Content is what dictates the design. So that's why like a picture UI is very different from a camera UI or very different from a social network UI. That's because the content is what dictates the UI and interactions as a result. Yeah, don't try the hamburger menu. Like, go with a tab bar. I will always choose tab bar over hamburger menu anytime. One thing I would say is that there are resources out there that really helps you. So, for example, refactoring UI is really great for developers because it allows them to look at some of the popular cases for which you have a certain UI, and then how can we improve that based on those action points. And I think the idea of redesigning something is very powerful for learning. So what I would say is, as an exercise, take your app design and try to improve it using all of those action points. And try to not learn too much, but just enough so that you, for example, I'm going to give you an example. The iOS guidelines is something that I would try to learn, especially pertaining to visual design. There's a tab called visual design. It's not very long, but if you can take like 30 minutes reading that, it's going to help you tremendously, for sure. And that's also exactly what I'm going to try to do in my course, is to practice, right? Like, it's one thing for me to say to you, okay, these are the things that you're going to do. You're probably not going to do it after the stream anyways, but what I want to do is to sort of like, create a course for developers. And I'm actually someone who's sort of like evolved over time based on that concept of like, get just enough to be dangerous. Learn just enough code to be dangerous. Learn just enough visual design to be dangerous. Just enough web, just enough Flutter, just enough React Native. And to have a really good opinion of all of those things. I'm that kind of person. And some people are like that. Some people are more specialized. Some people are generalists. Some people are, really into one single platform. I'm definitely more towards a generalist. But that being said, I have to be good at one thing. Otherwise, nobody's going to listen to me. So I did start as a designer. And I'm sure you start as a developer, if I'm not wrong. Be really good at one thing and then expand. But the second thing that you expand to, don't learn everything at once. Otherwise, you're going to lose motivation. So that's what I want to focus on in my course, is basically to teach you just enough about typography, colors, spacing, design transformation, iterations, animations, all of those things. Just enough. Don't get bored. Have fun. And, create something that you're really passionate about.
So it's learn some things, but not too much. take some risks, but not too many risks, but ultimately be dangerous.
Yeah. Be
All right.
dangerous.
Well, that's been 90 minutes. Thank you very much for your time, Meng. It's been wonderful having you here. Thank you for answering all the questions, and thank you for the folks who are coming along to ask all the questions. Where can folks find you on the web?
So I have a Twitter account, Meng To. It's just 6 letters. And I have designcode.io that I run. I teach designers how to code, and I teach developers how to design. I'm really excited about this new course about this UI design for developers. I think that there are not enough resources for design for developers, especially to teach them without bullshit, basically. Like, go straight to the point, teach them enough of all of the things that they need in their work to be dangerous. And so that's what I'm working on, and hopefully this is going to succeed. It seems to draw a lot of interest, and I hope this is the kind of market that we're going to move into. Because if you think about it, like 6 years ago, there were no designers who were teaching Xcode at the time, and I really, really wanted to change that. So that's where we decided. I decided to create a Design Plus Code, and fast forward 6 years, this is where we are, and I believe that we're starting to see a lot more designers getting into SwiftUI now, and I hope we can do the same for developers getting into design. There are not enough resources, and I want developers to know that they have so much power over what they can do, because they're the one that codes the whole thing, and they just need just enough design to make it really, really awesome.
Fantastic. So folks, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. It means a lot. It helps YouTube recommend it. You can also subscribe to my channel. I make more videos like this one, teaching you Swift and SwiftUI and meeting great folks like Meng. I want to thank my sponsor again, Bitrise, who make it super easy to do continuous integration, continuous delivery, signing, testing, and way, way more, all on the web. And they've got a brilliant free plan. Go and check them out, bitrise.io. Once again, thanks to everyone who came along for the live show and brought their questions, and thanks to my guest, Meng, for answering them all so very, very thoroughly. Until next time, folks, take care. Bye.